The word assassin might trace back to a medieval Arabic term for people who used cannabis. That is the story most dictionaries will tell you. It is vivid, it is memorable, and historians have been arguing about whether it is actually true for the better part of a century. Today, we're going to dig into where this word really came from, who first told that drug story, and why it stuck so hard even the scholars cannot fully shake it. The 11th and 12th centuries in the Middle East were a pressure cooker. The Crusades were tearing through the Levant. The Islamic world was fractured between Sunni caliphates and Shia splinter groups. Inside that chaos, a sect of Ismaili Shia Muslims known as the Nizari established a network of mountain fortresses, the most famous being Alamut in northern Persia. They were politically isolated, surrounded by enemies far more powerful than themselves, and they developed a strategy to compensate for that imbalance. Instead of fielding armies, they sent individuals, specifically trained operatives who would get close to a target, a sultan, a caliph, a crusader lord, and kill them. It was asymmetric warfare, medieval style. To their enemies, these operatives became a source of genuine terror. The crusaders who encountered them brought stories back to Europe, and with those stories came a word they had picked up in Arabic, something that sounded like hashshashin, or assassin. The question is, what did that word actually mean? Origin story. The etymology here is genuinely murky, and the famous cannabis explanation comes with a long and complicated paper trail. The story that most people know was popularized in the West largely through Marco Polo, who visited the region in the late 13th century and wrote about an old man of the mountain who supposedly lured his followers into a secret garden paradise, drugged them with hashish, and convinced them they had glimpsed heaven, motivating them to kill on his behalf in hopes of returning to it. Polo's account is colorful. It is also almost certainly embellished or entirely invented. He was writing decades after the Nizari strongholds had been destroyed by the Mongol invasions of the 1250s, relying on second-hand tales. The Arabic root at the center of this debate is the word hashish, referring to dried cannabis preparations. The proposed connection is that hashshashin simply meant hashish users, a derogatory label applied to the Nizari by their enemies. The Syrian chronicler Abu Shama, writing in the 12th century, did use terminology connecting the Nizari to the word hashish, and for a long time that was treated as evidence enough. The problem is that the word hashish in medieval Arabic was not exclusively about cannabis. It could also mean simply dried herb or grass, and using it as a slur might have meant little more than calling someone a lowlife, a grass eater, an insult about social class rather than drug use. The historian Bernard Lewis, one of the foremost scholars of the Nizari in the 20th century, examined these sources carefully and concluded that the drug connection was almost certainly a hostile fabrication, a smear by political and religious opponents rather than a description of actual practice. Lewis pointed out that none of the Nizari's own writings, and they were prolific, ever mentioned hashish as part of their religious practice. The outsiders invented the narrative, and the Crusaders and later European travelers happily repeated it because it confirmed what they wanted to believe about their exotic and terrifying enemies. The earliest records of the word appearing in European languages date to forms that suggest the scribes were simply trying to render what they heard, a foreign group name, not a drug reference, they recognized. The misconception. Here is where we need to be precise about what the misconception actually is. It is not that the Arabic word hashshashin does not exist. It does appear in medieval sources. The misconception is the causal story built around it, specifically that the Nizari operatives were drugged with hashish, that this was a recruitment or control mechanism, and that the name therefore literally described drug-addled killers. That narrative was a medieval propaganda invention, likely spread by the Nizari's enemies, and it was turbocharged by European travelers who had every incentive to portray Islamic sects as bizarre and chemically deranged. Scholars, including Farhad Daftari, who has written extensively on Ismaili history, argue that the Nizari were a sophisticated political and religious organization, highly disciplined, theologically serious, and that the hashish story says more about medieval prejudice than about actual Nizari practice. The word assassin in European languages probably derives from an attempt to render the group's name phonetically, and that group's name may or may not have ever had anything to do with cannabis. The drug story was the explanation invented after the fact. Modern echoes. The word assassin today carries no drug connotation whatsoever. It means someone who kills a politically significant target, usually for ideological or strategic reasons, and it shows up constantly in news cycles, political discussions, legal definitions, and fiction. What is interesting is that the word's journey stripped away every specific cultural layer it once had. The Nizari connection is gone, the Islamic context is gone, the hashish story is gone. What remains is purely functional, a person who kills with deliberate intent for political effect. The word made that transition through French and Italian before arriving in English. each language smoothing away the exotic specificity of the original. In legal contexts, distinctions between murder and assassination often hinge on whether the victim held public office or symbolic importance. The word still carries weight precisely because of the medieval fear it encoded, the idea of a hidden operative appearing from nowhere who cannot be stopped by conventional means. Deeper connections. The word hashish itself made it into English entirely separately, traveling through a different route and arriving with its cannabis meaning intact. So English ended up with two descendants of that same Arabic cluster, assassin, carrying the political violence meaning, and hashish carrying the drug meaning, with most speakers having no idea the two are etymologically tangled. The word hashish in English dates to well after assassin had already settled into its current meaning, which is part of why the connection feels surprising today. The Nizari Ismailis, by the way, still exist. The community is now led by the Aga Khan, and they number in the millions across Central Asia, South Asia, and diaspora communities worldwide. They are known for educational philanthropy and development work, which makes the medieval reputation for drug-fueled murder operatives feel particularly incongruous. History is often like that. A word out lives the reality it described, carrying distorted information forward for centuries. The broader pattern here is worth noting. Words that enter a language through fear or conflict almost always carry the distortions of whoever was doing the fearing. Hashshashin came into European languages through crusader encounters, filtered through hostility and misunderstanding, and the etymology that attached to it reflects exactly that process. Etymology is not just about linguistics. It is a record of who was telling the story and what they needed you to believe. What is next? If this kind of deep dig into a word's real history is your thing, subscribe so you do not miss the next one. Coming up, we are looking at a common English word that everyone assumes is ancient but was actually invented by a single writer in the 18th century, and the story of how it colonized the language is stranger than any etymology we have covered so far.